said, Tim, why are you involved in politics? It's a mucky business. It's not really a good thing for a Christian to do. I remember what my answer was then, but the years that followed, I've thought about it a lot and thought, yes, politics is a mucky business, but then again, so is everything else since the fall. And it's an opportunity and an arena in which to serve. It's a mission field.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to be with you. Simon Gilbo here. And this week I am with Tim Farron. Tim Farron's, for those of you that aren't familiar with the British political context, he was the leader of the Liberal Democrats between 2015 and 2017. So in the UK, you've got Conservatives and Labour as two main parties, but the Liberal Democrats are a very significant third party. In fact, they were in coalition from 2010 to 2015, and so they have a very significant voice, a key voice to play in our democratic system. Tim's been a Member of Parliament for Westmoreland Lonsdale since 2005, and before that, I gather you're in higher education. So that's a bit of introduction. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. So most of my guests, Tim, are friends over the years. I can't claim that of you yet, but you are friends with one of my absolute best buddies on the planet, Mark Harris, and he works as chaplain with Christians in Parliament, and you're part of a weekly Bible study and fellowship group that Mark leads.
Yeah.
I love the concept, by the way. You might want to talk into that these groups of MPs and peers, cross-party, all parties. It's really precious, isn't it? The unity of the body of Christ across parties.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I have literally just come from my Bible study fellowship time led by Mark Harris before joining you, Simon. And in that group, there's several Conservative MPs, several Labour MPs, one or two members of the Scottish National Party, an independent peer, a Conservative peer, and me, and led by Mark and his colleague Claire, who have become really great friends, who run Christians in Parliament, which is very much not a campaign organisation and very much a fellowship. And it's, amongst the things I've learned in my time in politics, one of the dangers for a Christian politician is that you can become a coal out of fire. You aren't as connected with your church as you might be because you are away half the week and you don't do your house groups. And I've suffered very much, I think, I'm a culprit rather than the victim, but I've suffered very much from that absence or that sort of punctuated, fellowship experience over the last sort of 16 and a half years. And yet the thing that helps massively, and in the last few years especially, is being part of a parliamentary fellowship that Mark leads.
Terrific. I was involved in a sort of similar one, not as a member of Parliament, but facilitating in Burundi, which is where I sort of spent 20 years. And
amazing, very powerful
experiences we had across, in a context of massive suspicion and post-genocide conflict, and people, who had killed each other's family members being reconciled, across the political divide. Absolutely stunning. Now, listen, I would love to just go back. We can read about your life. I did some research, but I'd love to go back earlier in terms of what shaped you and your youth and upbringing. What would be the sort of key building blocks of your life from your childhood upwards and coming to faith?
Well, I wasn't brought up in a Christian home, really. I guess I was born in 1970, so I think vestiges of churchiness were still around for that generation. Most of my friends, very few people I knew went to church, some, but not very many. Yet we would still be taught default Bible stories at school. So an awareness of faith, awareness of Christianity, an assumption that because you're English, you're therefore Christian, a generally positive view of Jesus, but also a bit of a ossified one. This is an old book, thousands of years old. This seemed like a very nice, wise, lovely human being who lived a couple thousand years ago. I'm sure he can teach us something, but he's not all important to us. My parents split up when I was just shy of my 5th birthday. My sister was and is 2 years younger than me. My mum passed away, 17 years ago now, but in her early 50s, sadly. But she was a great mum and taught me to think and taught me to be very sceptical about all sorts of things, ask questions. I think a very English sort of sniffiness about anybody who takes anything too seriously. Right. Don't be too keen, you know what I mean? And so that didn't mean that faith was completely, typexed out of our experience, but certainly anybody who was to, live for Jesus. And so when I became a Christian at 18, she certainly found that quite a tricky and challenging thing. Before she died, when she was just, 54, she did come to put her trust in Jesus, which is an amazing thing. And in no small part, I think, because I was there and able to share the gospel with her. So I'm very grateful for that. But yeah, so brought up to ask lots of questions. I always say, and I think it's, so here's how I think I became a Christian. She was, so she struggled, there were times where she had very little money whatsoever. And she was divorced from my dad, but I remember her telling me years later that she pawned her wedding ring just to pay for the mortgage. So things were not always very easy. Although my dad was very helpful, but he didn't have a load of money either. But when she went back to university, she ended up becoming a lecturer at what was then Preston Polytechnic, but is now the University of Central Lancashire. And to cut a long story short, she got seconded with half the rest of her department to go and help run a college in Singapore, which, by the way, completely bombed and failed, didn't it? But the point is, I went with her, and I think I'd only been abroad once in my life before then. And spent most of the summer between A-levels and university. So, finishing full-time education, then going into university education. And the house that we were put in had been lived in by previous employees of that college, academics, who'd moved on to do something else, but they'd left their books behind in the room that I got plonked in. And I got bored and I ended up reading some of them. And they were these terrifying and weird God books. And without going into too much detail, it struck me that, gosh, Christianity's true. I better do something about it. Now, my quick caveat to that is, and it only really occurred to me years later, that my mum, for all that she was a skeptic and not a Christian when I was a child, she was very much a child of the 60s and had friends who were even more child of the 60s, children of the 60s, and very much into every wacky idea going. And she had a lovely friend called Yvonne, who was into all sorts of wacky things, Nostradamus, astrology, all that kind of thing. But she also met somebody, as she searched, who was a Christian. And I remember Yvonne and this guy who I've never met, but I'll never forget his voice, being round, and he encouraged my mum and Yvonne to ask Jesus into their hearts. And I was upstairs in bed and I heard it and I thought, that sounds really important. And I did it and I was 9. And in the years that come, and I thought nothing else about it since. And the years since, though, or rather more recently, in the last 5 or 10 years, it's occurred to me that God is neither deaf nor forgetful, nor contemptuous or sniffy about a childlike or a non-intellectual, a simple inquiry, prayer, expression of faith. So I don't think God was snorting. He doesn't know what he's doing. As I look back, I kind of think from that point on, in the nicest possible way, my fate was sealed. But who knows? But it's helped to break my... It's helped to be a rebuke to me, because there is a slight sense when I talk about my coming to faith as an 18-year-old that what I'm really saying to the world is that I'm a terribly clever person who cleverly discovered Christianity and how true it is. When actually that's a load of rubbish. Obviously, in any event, it's a load of rubbish because God reveals, I don't discover. Yeah. But in any event, maybe, just maybe, that was a stepping stone along the way, a journey that began with me with a completely innocent, childlike expression as a 9-year-old.
So I think you went to Newcastle University, was that right? And is that a place where your faith got cemented and rooted?
Yeah, I mean, ups and downs. So yes, and it's also a place where I fell, and there were some real challenges as well. It was a place I got baptised. But so I became a Christian, let's say, at 18, away at university. Not away at university, away in Singapore. I did not meet, that was the beginning of August, may even been the 1st of August, 1988. I was 18. I go to university the very end of September, let's say 29th of September that year. So that's a good about 2 months, which that's not long, but in one sense it was an age. I became a Christian in Singapore, and then for the next 8 or 9 weeks, I didn't meet another Christian. I told people. I told my mum. She thought it was strange. I came home from Singapore about 2-3 weeks later, and all my mates, who were still my mates, I should say, none of whom were Christians. I told them quite enthusiastically, and it worried them. A, because there's quite implications for them, and B, Tim's gone mad. But I never actually met another Christian until I get to university. And I get a knock on the door in my hall of residence room from my next door neighbour, who at that point obviously I had not met. He was a tall second-year medic called Pete, and he invited me to Navigators. Now, you'll probably know many of you know Navigators, the kind of international Christian sort of student movement. And this guy Pete kind of had no idea that I was a Christian. There was no sign on my door. I'd said nothing to no one. And yet he knocked on my door and invited me. And that was the beginning of me, getting some fellowship and beginning to mature as a Christian. Brackets, I often say that I've picked it up off somebody else, but the challenge for Christians, insofar as the world's concerned, is twofold. One is to hide away, and the other is to blend in. And they're opposite temptations. And for me, the temptation has always been to blend in. And so, yes, in one sense, I matured and became established in my faith at university. And I also did a heck of a lot of blending in, involved in politics, going out on the town. Most of my mates were not Christians. So, it was let's not pretend that my time at university was saintly and a vertical introduction into the faith.
Yeah, no, me too. So, in terms of your political consciousness, was presumably being shaped there. And did I read that you started out, conservative, and there was a time when you were late? I mean, was there flip-flopping in terms of finding your identity and your thinking?
Well, perhaps not. I mean, I think so. If I look back and even think of myself now to a degree, but part of my, I always say vanity is the sin that is the real problem for politicians. Somebody once said that politics is showbiz for ugly people. And you're not good at anything else, so if you want to be on the telly, it's one way of managing it. But so vanity. So I think and I think there's a level of. So I was an awkward kid. But a seriously awkward kid. I wasn't a cool awkward kid. I was into stuff, the music, the football teams, and the politics that nobody else was into. Now, so I remember as a child, it's been brought back from stasis recently. It was much better when I was a kid. Spitting Image, sort of the puppet kind of lampooning satire show, which mostly focused on politics. And so politics was the thing we all talked about. I think that in the days only 3 or 4 channels. There was Top of the Pops, a music show on a Thursday night, and a Spitting Image on a Sunday night. And the following morning at school, we were all full of, did you see? Did you see? Yeah. So even people who were not interested in politics would think Spitting Image was funny, and they'd all be able to do the voices of the people doing the voices of the politicians. Yeah. So there's an element of that. So there was part of me that really quite admired Margaret Thatcher just because everybody else hated her. But at school, I was blessed with doing economics, O-level, as they were. And I think as I saw, the joblessness around me in Lancashire, I didn't start to hate Margaret Thatcher or anything like that. But I started to think, I do not agree with this woman. I might think she's an admirable person. I quite like the people who are prepared to be unpopular to do what they believe in. But I discovered that I did not agree with her. One little bit, and some of what she did I thought was quite morally wrong. I mean, my take is that the government at those times deliberately created more unemployment than was necessary because it was an economic and political tool. It kept trade union membership down. It kept price inflation down. Now, using other people's misery to achieve a political end that is a definition of wickedness, I would say. So, but it doesn't mean I hated Margaret Thatcher. I'm not one of these people who goes get red in the face about her. But I did admire her. But I was clear that I wasn't her. And then a supporter of hers. And then, I remember watching a Kathy Come Home when I was about 14, which is obviously a film about, homelessness. And it made me, I often say I get involved in politics properly because something made me cry. That made me cry. I joined Shelter. I went and bought a postal order for £1.50. If anybody knows what a postal order is these days, but I did, and joined Shelter. That was my first political act. And I was also, maybe an awkward kid. I'll go to sixth form college, and my first, week or so there, I joined the Liberals, largely because I was fairly sure I wasn't Labour or Tory, and I had this vague sense that I liked the cut of the Liberals' jib. I liked the fact that they were awkward. I liked the fact that they were the party to join if you weren't, a crowd follower.
Yeah, interesting. Now, can you just, we talk about liberalism and lots of people would struggle to define it from different, sides of the pond typically, but can you define liberalism and how do your Christian values interface with and inform your political ones?
Well, look, I joined a political party and got very politicised before I became a Christian. And I do, on my podcast, I talk to lots of Christian politicians, and I'm always, I won't say envious, but maybe slightly, full of admiration of those MPs who are Christians who entered politics because they felt a calling. It was a thing that they could do to serve God and serve their neighbour out of their Christian faith. And that wasn't the case for me. I almost had to kind of, recalibrate my politics having become a Christian. I remember, again, the title of my podcast is A Mucky Business, and that comes from a conversation I had with a lad called Adrian, who would at a coffee morning or something with the Navigators. Really nice lad in my Hull residence. He had a twin who was also in my Hull residence, and he just, very, very kindly, he wasn't being horrible about this. He said, Tim, why are you involved in politics? It's a mucky business. It's not really a good thing for a Christian to do. I remember what my answer was then, but in the years that followed, I've thought about it a lot and thought, well, yes, politics is a mucky business, but then again, so is everything else since the fall. And it's an opportunity and an arena in which to serve. It's a mission field. But in terms of liberalism, obviously there's various different angles you could look at, but to be a libertarian is to say, I can do whatever I want and I should be allowed to do whatever I want. And I am not a libertarian. A liberal says that people should be able to do what they want so far as it doesn't injure anyone else or impinge upon their rights, at which point we then have to have a debate. And liberalism is therefore quite an attractive ideology, if you like, because it isn't scientific and black and white. It involves you thinking and making compromises. It's why I kind of admire Marxists, or almost feel, again, a slight bit of envy of them, because the world's so simple. It really is black and white. There is a scientific solution to everything. And liberalism says, no, there isn't. And again, in these days of, what people call cancel culture and freedom of speech concerned and all that kind of thing, the thing is, any old fascist can defend the rights of people who are like them and who they fully approve of. Yeah. It takes a liberal to defend the rights of people that you don't understand, don't agree with, and don't approve of. And given that we as Christians can find ourselves in the unapproved of category, we should be very careful if we go around cancelling, shall we say, people who think different things to us, because that could apply to us as well. And actually, if you look at the genesis of the Liberal Party, the Liberal movement in the UK in the 19th century, that's exactly where it came from. It was led by evangelicals, nonconformists, Gladstone and others. Because I think there's something innately Christian about liberalism, in that it's about the value and the dignity of every single human being. But B, a very utilitarian thing, is that, non-Anglican Christians in the UK, so Bible-believing Christians and others in the 19th century were persecuted. And so the Liberal Party kind of came out of that. It was a values thing, but also a utilitarian thing. And, my fear is that not just liberal parties, but all parties have kind of forgotten how much of our small L, small d liberal democracies in the West of in the world's West owe their very existence to values which are unmistakably biblical.
Yeah. Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. As followers of Jesus, we're called to tell the truth. How do we follow that calling in a world where, especially in politics, lying seems to become so utterly normalised and modelled from the top?
So I think, well, obviously, the temptation is a very real thing, isn't it? And temptation is hard. I mean, the Bible study we've just done, we've been looking at Hebrews 4 and 5 and how Jesus was tempted in any way and resisted. And Mark Harris, our mutual friend, quoted C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity. Only someone who's tried to resist temptation has realised how hard it is. Yeah. And so, there are lots of temptations we all face. And when your currency is popularity, because that's what when we all as human beings have this desire and need almost to be loved and thought well of. But in politics, there's that, and there's again the utilitarian need to win a majority so you're in power, or you at least win your seat. And so there is a temptation to over-egg the pudding. And so here's so lying is always wrong, and all human beings do it. I think there is a difference, however, of scale between making a promise in an election that you kind of sort of fairly sincerely, but maybe absent-mindedly make, and there's a bit of exaggeration there, and you get into power and you realise, actually, I can't do this. Well, that's wrong, and that's a breach of trust. But you talked about normalisation of lying and at the risk of sounding like an old guy saying the old days were better, because, they weren't in many ways. I fear that in Western democracies in recent time, not just in Western democracies, but principally, whether it's via, the rise of fake news or the development of a culture war, which is stoked by some, telling lies is a strategy rather than just an accident. And I find that deeply troubling, because truth is something we as Christians need to cling to, and it's something that Christians in politics need to be particularly aware. It's part of our witness, but also part of us being salt in a rotten system, is just to be intolerant of lies. Because what governments do, what political movements do, is recognise that in a world of an avalanche of social media and a 24-hour news, that if you can, you do something awful and you just lie about it and you just tough it out for 3 or 4 days, the news cycle will move on and you will not be held to account. And people have worked that out. And they've also worked out that in this day of culture war, people will vote for you because you're the guy who upsets the people you really hate. And so the people who vote for you don't really care about your moral integrity. So they just care about using you to break the window. And so I think that whatever we think about politics and politicians as a breed, there is something which the media and we as a society as a whole are partly responsible for, which politicians have to lead in, a really troubling development in the last 10 years, let's say, in our discourse, where lying absolutely becomes normalised, like you say, and almost part of the strategy.
Yeah, it's very discouraging, objectively, isn't it, to just observe and see modelled literally by the leaders down. Now, looking at your career, obviously you're very popular in your neck of the woods because you've been re-voted in, I think, So from 2010, 2015, there were 57 Liberal Democrat MPs, and then only 8 of you survived. So the coalition time was pretty disastrous. But you were one of the 8, which I guess meant that sort of propagated you to the position of leadership. How did you find and how did your faith enable you or limit you in your leadership of the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I think I said earlier on that vanity is the great temptation, I think, for people, Christians, people who are involved in politics. And so, I prayed about whether I would stand for leader, but I think my desire to be leader meant that maybe I didn't rest upon God and inquire of him quite as sincerely as I might. There was a sense in which, I've been a member of the largest ever Liberal Democrat group in Parliament and the smallest ever group in Parliament. And so when there's 8 of you, you've just come out of government, the absolutely shattering experience for the party to lose 90% of its MPs, pretty much, 80-odd%. And I certainly told myself that, there was an opportunity, which I write about in my book, A Better Ambition, that maybe a year before the general election, where Nick Clegg, our former leader and the Deputy Prime Minister, may have stepped down. I don't know how seriously he contemplated it, but he certainly spoke to me about it. So there was an opportunity that I might have become leader a year earlier, at the back end of the coalition. And I didn't want Nick Clegg to step down for all sorts of good and honourable reasons. And I also didn't want him to step down because I didn't think I could do it. I took the view that the skill set I had was not really suited to being Deputy Prime Minister, not at that point, but it was suited to perhaps galvanising and energising and motivating and inspiring as a kind of defiant rump, a party that had been battered and bruised and needed putting back together again. I thought I had those skills, but not the skills necessary to sit in a big office and run the country, not at that point. Sure. So I think I was aware of what my abilities were and what they weren't. But nevertheless, the great honour to become a party leader is something that is quite beguiling. So it's not that I shouldn't have stood, but I think I should have been prepared to have had people ask me more questions and to inquire more of God as to what I do. Because when all said and done, so I became leader. I did 2 years, we rebuilt our local government presence, started winning elections again. In the general election that I was leader during, we increased our numbers back from 8 to 12, so we moved in the right direction. So I think on the party membership doubled. On the basic metrics, you wouldn't give me 10 out of 10, but you'd probably give me a reasonable 7. Yeah. And in terms of the metrics, but people will probably remember that I was that guy who was a rabbit in the headlights, asked lots of questions about sin and what Christianity meant on moral issues like abortion, sexuality, and what have you. And so I think and I don't go around beating myself up about that at all, because I'm much happier doing what I'm doing, and I feel that God has called me to use what profile I've got to be of use to him in politics and whatever else he calls me to do next. But there's no doubt that the media thought it was really very interesting that this guy was left of centre and liberal in his politics, but clearly from their perspective was a conservative evangelical. How does that work?
And you were defending, weren't you? Defending the rights of the LGBT community. They viewed you as a friend, didn't they?
Well, I think they did, and then you think, well, why can't you answer a simple question about what is and isn't sin? And I guess the point is that to go back to what I said earlier on, a true liberal defends the rights of people who make different choices to you, and which I did and do, not as a kind of defensive thing, because I genuinely believe it. I mean, the guy who signed me up to the Liberals was gay. I'm not sure if I knew that at that time, but I soon afterwards did, and I realised he was properly bullied. And that is outrageous, and that's one of the things that sort of motivated me to think, yes, I'd chosen the right party. But I think that what the Bible says to us about sex and sexuality and everything else is a reminder that our identity in this life, whether it's to do with our gender, our sex, or our politics or anything, they're not unimportant. Of course they're not unimportant, but they are comparatively puny when compared to eternity and our relationship with God. And But, when you're leader of a party which is getting like 90 seconds worth of coverage a day during an election, you haven't got time to do big theological answers. And it was a real frustration that I felt as leader of the Liberal Democrats. I was trying to talk about Brexit and the National Health Service and pensions and so on. Yeah. And all people wanted to do is talk about Leviticus.
Yeah. So Tim, just without dredging it all up, can you just do 2 minutes on, I mean, you were being hounded, weren't you, to just literally say, is gay sex a sin? Is that what it was?
Mm. That was kind of the thing. And I mean, hounded is not the word I would use. I mean, I think in many ways, if I had been more open with my almost exclusively non-Christian team around me about this, about what the Bible teaches about such things, then I probably think we would have probably prepared better answers. In the end, I was a rabbit in the headlights, and so in the end, I kind of gave an answer which is not really true to kind of push it away, which I repent of and move on from. In the end, I think when I'm asked about those questions now, I generally try and take, let's remember what Jesus' example was, that he often didn't give a straight answer. Mm-hmm. He would often answer a question with a question, because the questioner doesn't necessarily need to know the thing they're asking. They need to know the thing that they need to know. And one thing that I've been helped to understand is that people get angry, and understandably angry, about the thought that a person might dislike them or disapprove of them, or worse still, want to persecute them. None of those things are true from my perspective. But when we think about faith, let's remember this. I would say to someone, if there is a God, let's just, suspend disbelief for a moment. Let's assume there's a God, and he's perfect and almighty, and you're not, and I'm not. Then if that God just affirms everything you already think, pats you on the back and encourages you, then you can be pretty sure that insofar as that God is concerned, Richard Dawkins is right. He's a delusion. He's an extension of you. You've made him up. Yeah. Because if there's a real God, then he will contradict you and he will disturb you. And if you hear things which are contradicting you and disturbing you, there's a chance you've met the real God.
Yeah, that's good. So that led you. Did that incident particularly? I mean, it was, you took your party by surprise when you resigned, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, people don't remember this so much, but we had a by-election gain in Richmond Park, which was a big surprise. We made a call on Brexit, which was Marmite-ish. It offended some, but it inspired many others, and it arguably trebled our party membership. We started winning council by-elections. We increased our number of MPs by 50%, brackets, that's 4. But nevertheless, so, like I say, by any objective analysis, the 2 years that I spent as leader saw, making, modest but very clear progress. So yes, I think there were some people who were very dissatisfied by the fact that we'd spent the election campaign with me, spending at least the first of those 7 weeks of the campaign trying to fight off various theological questions. But we'd been successful, and there was now a hung parliament, and we were set to be quite significant again. I had made the decision during the election, though, that the problem, we could have done so much better in that election. That's the frustration, and a major reason was me. And it was a bit like I was, if you've got an advertising hoarding and it's constantly vandalised by somebody and you can't read what's on it, you're not getting your message across. And that's kind of where I was. That I was the main conveyor of the message for the party, and yet people weren't hearing anything about Brexit or the NHS, because all I was doing was trying to play a straight back to, ever more obscure theological questions, and asked by people who didn't really want the answers. And so I kind of took the view that I've either got to, and I took this during this decision early in the election campaign after all of this, I've either got to be a rubbish leader and have to constantly bat this stuff away all the time and not get the party's message across, not do my job properly, or I've got to basically, backslide and say things I don't agree to get rid of the issue. And so either be a bad leader or be a bad Christian. And I thought, well, that's a rubbish choice. Yeah. So let's not do either of those. And instead, if following Jesus matters, let's put him first. It was a great honour to be party leader. I joined the party as a 16-year-old. I bought into the history and the culture of the party. I love the Liberals, its quirkiness, and so many of my friends, developed through my time in politics. I'd, risen through the ranks: councillor, MP, backbencher, frontbencher, party president, party leader. So, it meant an awful lot to me that I was party leader, and I was able to say, and I hope this was a reasonable act of witness, I was able to say, but I'm going to give this up willingly. I don't have to. We've just done relatively well in the election. I don't have to give this up, but I'm going to, because following Jesus is better and being faithful is better. So I often think the most useful thing I've ever done as a Christian was to resign as leader.
Well, I remember listening to you and reading your speech. I reread it yesterday when you resigned as party leader. You said you were relinquishing the position for something, I quote, so amazing, so divine, from the hymn, that it demands my heart, my life, my soul, my all. And so you were clear in your witness in your speech, and yet you said that, I forget the wording exactly, but being a follower of Jesus seemed to be incompatible with maintaining a position in public office. Would that be right?
Well, I think it was for me. And let's remember that, two things. I was party president for 4 of the 5 years that we were in coalition. I was leader for 2 years. I'm still a member of parliament, 16 and a half years on. So if there is a kind of glass ceiling for Christians in politics, it's relatively high. And I, as I said earlier on, I think if I had been more honest with my team, more open with my team about what and be prepared to cope with their horror to what the Bible teaches on certain things, because unlike them, younger than me, they wouldn't have grown up at a time where churchiness was still vaguely normal. This would have come as a terrible surprise to them that the Bible teaches uncomfortable things about the lives that we lead. But if I've been, which gives you an explanation as to why I was too chicken to do that, but if I hadn't been chicken, if we talked about these things, then I think I would have been able to answer that line of questioning maybe better. And I have since felt really, really blessed and really privileged to talk totally informally, and I'm definitely not going to give any names at all, but to other younger Christian politicians, to talk them through how they might deal with these issues better than I did. And I heard one of them on the radio not long ago doing a blindingly good job, and this person will rise higher than I did, shall we say. And so, Christians, when I met a lovely, I ended up speaking at St. Helens Bishopsgate a couple of years ago, which was a real blessing, and I met lots of great people as a result. But the reason that happened was because a young guy who was in the congregation spoke to me at a bus stop outside Westminster, and he said, I was going to get involved in politics. He said, I'm a big fan, and worse the effect of, I was going to get involved in politics, and then you put me off. and the point being, because of all the things we just discussed. But I think, well, that's an interesting perception, and it's a shame. And don't be put off. Learn from my mistakes. Don't be put off.
Yeah. My involvement in Burundi, so 20 years in Africa, we've been desperately trying to raise critical thinkers and patriots that love their nation, that will engage in politics. But it's really as a matter of life and death out there, because it's very dangerous to be in opposition, essentially. But so out there, I'm trying to get people to stand that have a higher sort of set of values. You'd be sort of imploring people, would you, to not be put off politics, to sign up and get involved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of my mission today, so I have a small organisation called Faith in Public, which helps me to do Christian stuff, Simon, and a whole bunch of things, whether it be my passion for supporting refugees or those in housing need, but also making the case for the gospel in a public way, and also helping to equip Christians to think about politics. We have another mutual friend, Andy Flanagan, who runs Christians in Politics. And I always think that what Andy and his team do is about trying to recruit Christians into active political life at the top level, to stand for Parliament, for example. Faith in Public, part of my mission, I think, is to try and reach to the 97% who will never be in that sphere, but who will instead I nevertheless believe need to care about politics. So politics is a mucky business, but it's real, and Christians should be praying about it. If someone says that their wife is ill, what do you want to know as a Christian? You want to know what her name is and what's wrong with her, so that you can pray for her in an informed way. Likewise with politics. So the danger is that Christians, like anybody else, can fall foul of fake news, and so we need to be approaching politics from a Christian perspective and thinking about it. You don't need to join a party and for the council or even Parliament to be somebody who cares about the politics of the country, of their community, maybe even further afield. And being informed is right, and having opinions, forming opinions from a biblical perspective, which will not necessarily flush you to one party or another, but forming those opinions is really important. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm very passionate about, that we need to be culturally literate. We often dismiss the society being religiously illiterate. Well, I would, glibly say that's society's problem. Cultural illiteracy is our problem, and if we don't speak the language of the culture we've been put, then we won't communicate the gospel very well. So we need to understand it and pray about it, care about it, so that we can speak to our society. You don't need to, as somebody once said, worship the local gods in order to speak the local language. And on top of that, politics is a way of serving people in the now. I think the life of Jesus tells us that although he knew all was going to end well, I assume that. Particularly the raising of Lazarus, I think is an amazing story and an account of, and I'm sure, I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure Jesus must have known that in a few moments' time he was going to raise Lazarus. But he didn't go, hey, come on, girls, pull yourselves together. It's all going to end fine. Just wait and see what I'm going to do, to Martha and Mary. No, instead he entered in very utterly sincerely to their great pain and anguish. And I think that's what we're called to do. Yes, it is all going to end well. So don't panic about politics if you're a Christian, but do get involved, do care, enter into the now, feel and experience and join in with the pain and the suffering of the now, and serve to do your little bit better in the place that you've been put. We've been called to love our neighbour, and politics is a great way to do that.
Yeah, what you're saying makes me think of a quote I often share from Jim Wallace. Don't know if you come across him, but he says, when we talk about being engaged, it's so easy to have a default, and so many people are cynical about politics these days. And cynicism or action, it seems to be a choice, because cynicism ultimately protects you from commitment. And if he writes, if things are not really going to change, then why try so hard to make a difference? And if you have middle-class economic security, as many cynics do, things don't have to change for you to remain secure. That's not intended to sound harsh, just realistic. Cynics are finally free just to look after themselves. And perhaps the only people who view the world realistically are the cynics and the saints. Everyone else may be living in some kind of denial about what is really going on and how things really are. And the only difference between the cynics and the saints is the presence, the power, the possibility of hope. And hope's not a feeling, it's a decision. And the decision for hope is based on what you believe at the deepest levels. You choose hope, not as a naive wish, but as a choice, with your eyes wide open to the reality of the world, just like the cynics who have not made the decision for hope. And I think, yes, with regards politics and people sort of steering clear, there is so much cynicism. But the antidote to cynicism, as Jim Wallace writes, is action. It's not optimism; it's action that's born out of hope. And we, as followers of Jesus, do have a hope-filled message. So, I love what you're saying there, Tim. Have you got any sort of anecdotes, or you can think of times where you saw Jesus, clearly at work in your life over the last few years?
Well, yes. And I think above all else, revealing his amazing grace and reminding us how low the bar is set. So I think the two things that strike me in the midst of that general election when I was leader, where at times I felt I've not said the right thing. I've not said the right thing for God. And, I've done a wrong thing here. I've been a bad witness. And a very good friend of mine, in fact, my pastor, Paul, said to me, the thing for Christians is that sin spoils our relationship with God, but it doesn't end it. And I remember just like an absolute dam had broken when I heard that, that my position and my place in God's kingdom was secure. because it was not dependent upon me, and it isn't dependent upon me. Salvation is by grace alone, by faith alone, in Christ alone, not in me having. Something else somebody said to me was that you are as acceptable to God on your worst day as a Christian as you are on your best, because it's not about your performance. And I think that doesn't give me a sense of liberation to go and do, I'll go and do what I like now. It doesn't. It gives me an immense appreciation of this awesome God who loves us and has sent his son to save us, that you want to obey a God like that. So I think that was really powerful for me, and just a real experience of grace. And grace is something that we might intellectually get. To feel it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. The other thing, so I mentioned earlier on about me asking myself really a bit more these days, not that it matters that much, when did I actually become a Christian? Was it when I was 9? And I think that I come across as I interview Christian politicians for my Mucky Business podcast, you come across people who will, I ask people for their story. How did you become a Christian? And a lot of them were raised in a Christian family and became a Christian at, really much younger than 9. And I found that as a real rebuke to me and a reminder that the bar to becoming a Christian is incredibly low to non-existent. That we can think, as I said earlier on, that Christianity is something that we cleverly discover, and that there's some kind of intellectual bar we've got to get above, and some critical faculties you've got to have. And I think that revelation through talking to fellow Christians of other parties about their coming to faith. Some of them do have dramatic stories in later life, but some of them have really simple stories of an infant trust in Jesus that has grown over the years, and it reminds us that therefore Christianity is absolutely open to everybody. You could be a person living with dementia, you could be a person with learning difficulties, and you could be a person who is 5 years of age, who hears something in Sunday school and decides to follow Jesus and just keeps that up. So I think that is again a reminder of just how accessible Jesus is.
Yeah. We're sort of slowly coming towards an end now. Many politicians, once they've lost their ministerial position or leadership position, they step down as an MP in the next election. You haven't done that. So what are you up to now?
Well, so obviously love serving my constituency. How long that'll last for, I don't know. We've got boundary changes coming, so that'll be an interesting challenge. We'll see how long God decides to keep me in this place. But it's a great honour to serve as the leader of the party, but it's an honour and a joy to serve as a constituency MP for where I live, Lake District, Yorkshire Dales. It's an absolutely glorious place to serve, and wonderful people who've faced lots and lots of challenges as well. But in terms of what I've done, since I stepped down as leader, I set up Faith in Public, which again helps me to do a number of things, and not least to be able to write and to speak on matters of faith, and to try and use what profile I've got to give people who've not heard the gospel that much a chance to hear it. To try and make I talked about the simplicity of the gospel, and the how Jesus accepts people of whatever background, whatever intellectual capacity. But nevertheless, we live in a time where people think Christianity is unreasonable and irrational and old-fashioned and all that kind of thing. And having the opportunity in the world that I'm moving to be able to share the gospel and to explain there's deep rationality behind Christianity, and indeed it's more rational than the alternatives. It's something people find surprising, and I try graciously to take the opportunities that I have to make that case. So my most important thing I do as a Christian is to serve the people that I've been put alongside in my community and be a good MP. But in my kind of post-ambitious, slightly venerable state, I do have opportunities to work across party, hopefully to be trusted by people across party, to be known as a Christian, and to seek to be faithful as a Christian, and not least in trying to equip Christians to think about politics in a more biblical way, and to reach out to those people who've yet to hear the gospel or yet to accept it, to give them an opportunity to hear it and respond.
Terrific. Last question, maybe. What do you think God's teaching you at the moment?
Well, to rely on him, to be dependent upon him. The thing that I need is mercy, and I need it from him, and only he can offer it. I think it's dependency on the right things, and that right thing is God.
Tim, it's been a real pleasure. Why don't you spend the last minute just plugging a few things that, if we want to sort of read more about you. Talked about Better Ambition. That was the book you wrote. Faith in Public. Anything else?
Yeah, well, so yeah, A Better Ambition, which is available in some good bookshops, I believe, and probably some bad ones as well, where you can find out about all sorts of things, including my failed pop career. But the podcast that I do regularly now called A Mucky Business, which I do every week, and which features much more interesting people than me, politicians from all different parties, very senior ones, and some people with some interesting stories from outside direct the word of politics. And it's about trying to introduce people to the mucky business of politics and understanding what Christians are doing and can do in that world. So download it and like it, please.
Great stuff. Oh, Tim, it's been a real treat. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. It's been a real joy, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Well, everybody, I hope you've been inspired. It's interesting. A few weeks ago, we had Andy Flanagan talking on Christians in politics, and so we've had a few recent ones on politics. I love it how across all sort of different walks of life, followers of Jesus are modelling and living out their faith in inspiring ways. So I hope you've been inspired this week. I have. Next week we'll have another fantastic guest. Do give us a great review if you've enjoyed it, and share it with someone who you think will enjoy it. If you want to be in touch with me, simongilbert.com and various social media platforms. In the meantime, have a good week. We'll see you next time, and God bless. Toodaloo.